Bram had not made a sound in 47 hours. Not when the search teams fanned out across the eastern ridge in the dark, flashlights cutting through pine. Not when the helicopters came at dawn, low and loud, their rotors beating the air above the ravine. Knelt beside him at the mouth of the cave and whispered his name like a question she was afraid to finish asking. In 7 years of search and rescue work, Bram had never been a dog that barked during a search. Not once. His silence was the thing that made him different from other dogs, the thing that made experienced handlers stop and watch when he worked. A dog that barks loses something. Bram's silence was not emptiness. It was concentration taken to its furthest point. And then, from somewhere deep inside the cave, and then silence again. The search team coordinator, Deputy Colton Price, stopped walking. The 2 volunteers directly behind him stopped walking. The beam of Raina's headlamp swung forward into the dark. Nobody had told Bram where to look. Nobody had told him the boy might be underground at all. What happened in the next 20 minutes would be the subject of conversations for years, not only among the volunteers who were there, not only among the residents of that small mountain county, looking for the part that explained what Bram had done. There was no part that explained it. That was the point. The boy's name was Levi Okafor. He was 9 years old, and he had been missing for 47 hours and 22 minutes when Bram barked. He weighed 61 pounds. He was wearing a red jacket with a broken zipper and 1 sneaker. His voice careful and flat in the way that voices get when people are trying not to say what they are actually thinking. Levi had disappeared on a Tuesday afternoon in October, in the kind of October that mountain counties sometimes get where the light has a particular quality, sharp and golden and slightly wrong, like the sun is trying to show you something before it goes. His father, Darnell Okafor, had reported him missing at 6:14 in the evening, 40 minutes after he had gone to call Levi in for dinner and found the back door open and the yard empty. That Levi sometimes got absorbed in things and lost track of time. He believed it right up until he picked up the phone to call the sheriff's department, and then he stopped believing it all at once, completely, the way a structure collapses. Darnell was 38 years old. He had served 2 tours in the army and come back carrying things he never talked about. A stillness that people who didn't know him sometimes mistook for calm, but wasn't calm at all. It was the opposite of calm. It was every part of him holding its breath at the same time. He went very still when the dispatcher answered. He told her his son was missing. He gave her the address in a voice that did not shake. And when he ended the call and stood in the kitchen by himself for a moment, before the first patrol car arrived, he looked at the open back door and noticed for the first time that Levi's mud boots were still on the mat. Both of them, side by side. Levi had gone somewhere without his boots. In October. Darnell didn't tell the deputies about the boots right away. He told them almost everything else. He told them that Levi was quiet, that Levi was thoughtful, that Levi wasn't the kind of kid who ran off, that Levi had never done anything like this before. He told them about the divorce 2 years ago, and that Levi was adjusting, that they both were, and that Levi lived with him full-time now, and they were building something, the 2 of them, one piece at a time. 3 weeks earlier, the Millhaven County Search and Rescue Unit had run a training exercise on the Eastern Trail System. It was a routine exercise. 4 handlers with 4 dogs, working a staged scenario using volunteer hiders. Raina and Bram had been 2 of the 4 teams. The exercise had gone well. And at some point during the debrief, a small brown shoe had turned up at the staging area. A child's sneaker. It was Levi's shoe. He had apparently been watching the exercise from a distance, hidden in the brush at the edge of the property, and had lost a sneaker crossing back over the fence. One of the handlers had found it and left it at the staging area, and when Raina came to collect the last of the equipment, she brought it to the farmhouse. Levi had come to the door. Darnell had stood behind him. Raina had handed Levi the shoe and said they'd found it near the fence line. And Levi had looked past her, not rudely, just with a focus that was unmistakably aimed, and looked at Bram sitting in the back of the truck. He'd said, "Was that the dog that found my shoe?" And Raina had said, "Yes, that's Bram. He tracked your scent from the fence line." Levi had looked at Bram for a long moment. Bram had looked back at him. Neither of them moved. Darnell had thanked Raina and closed the door. He'd told Levi to put his shoe on and wash up for dinner. And that had been that. Except that it hadn't been that. Because Levi had spent the 3 weeks since then drawing pictures of dogs in his notebooks, looking up Belgian Malinois on Darnell's tablet when he thought Darnell wasn't watching, whether a dog could remember a smell after weeks had passed. Darnell had answered the questions as best he could. He hadn't made the connection until the second deputy asked him gently whether Levi had any favorite places on the property, anywhere he liked to go. Darnell said the eastern fence line. He's been going back there. The deputy wrote it down. The search had begun in the dark with 40 volunteers and 4 dogs. The terrain was difficult, steep in places, thick with undergrowth, cut through with creek drainages that ran cold and fast after the recent rain. Raina and Bram had started on the fence line at Darnell's property and worked outward, since before she had rebuilt herself into the person she was now. She knew the way he breathed when he was onto something. That grief had made possible in the way that grief sometimes makes possible the very things it seems to destroy. Her daughter had been 4 years old when she drowned in a lake in northern Michigan, in the kind of accident that has no explanation beyond the proximity of water and the speed at which a small body can become invisible in it. It had taken rescue divers 11 hours to find her. She did not talk about this. She mentioned it occasionally in the careful, neutral way of someone who has decided that the story belongs to the work and not to herself personally, that the only thing to do with that kind of weight is carry it somewhere useful and set it down. She had gotten Bram 2 years after the accident, when she had completed her handler certification and moved to Millhaven County, and the first time she had run him on a real search, a missing hiker in the Western Ridge terrain, and he had located the hiker in 6 hours, and the hiker had been alive. She had sat in her truck afterward and put her hands on the steering wheel and breathed for a long time without going anywhere. She had never told Bram what he was doing for her. She suspected he knew. She suspected this without being able to justify it, the same way she suspected many things about Bram that she could not justify, that were simply part of the understanding between them. She had seen that tilt twice in 7 years. The first time had been in a warehouse fire 2 counties over, where Bram had tilted left and then walked directly through 3 rooms of smoke and rubble to an unconscious woman behind a collapsed wall. Bram had not assumed that room had been cleared. The second time had been in a flooding event in a river town. There had been a teenager in there. He had been in the water for 4 hours. Raina did not tell people about the tilt. It was not something that fit neatly into incident reports. It was a thing she had observed, catalogued privately, and held close, the way you hold close the things that you cannot fully explain, but cannot afford to dismiss. At 7:14 in the morning, the second day of the search, Bram tilted left. They were at the eastern boundary of the main trail, near where a drainage channel cut under the trail through a concrete culvert and disappeared down the slope toward the old quarry. Bram stopped. He lowered his nose to the wet ground. And then he tilted, barely, just a few degrees. Just that small shift that Raina had learned meant something she couldn't name, but always paid attention to. She stopped. She watched him. And Raina followed without calling it in yet, without saying anything into the radio clipped to her shoulder, because she had learned that you gave Bram 30 seconds before you said anything. 30 seconds to see where this went, and that 30 seconds had saved lives twice already. He went down the slope, through the wet brush, along the edge of the quarry wall where the limestone face was slick with moisture. It wasn't obviously a cave entrance. It was a seam in the rock, roughly 3 feet wide, edged with dead fern and the kind of thick moss that meant water moved through the rock nearby. You could stand 6 feet from it and not notice it. Bram stood at the seam and did not move for 11 minutes. Raina had timed him later by going back to her radio log. 11 minutes, 4 seconds, not pawing at the ground, not circling. She called it in at minute 11. She said, "Bram has located a possible entry point, sending GPS coordinates, requesting backup." Deputy Price's voice came back flat and professional. He asked her to hold position. He said he'd have 2 people to her location in 15 minutes, and that a 9-year-old boy who had been missing for 40 hours in near freezing night temperatures was not likely to be found at the bottom of a cave. He did not say it. He just said, "Hold position." Raina held position. Bram did not move. And a retired game warden named Burl, who everyone called Burl, and whose last name Raina had never learned, and who had the particular quality of competence that people acquire over decades of work in difficult places, an ability to assess a situation without broadcasting their assessment to everyone around them. Burl looked at the seam in the rock and said, "I know this one." He said it's deeper than it looks. He said he'd been in maybe 30 yards back in the 90s, and it opened up into a decent-sized chamber. He had a headlamp. Raina had a headlamp. They went in. The cave floor dropped almost immediately, a slick limestone descent that forced them to move carefully, hand on the wall, feet testing each step. The air changed within 20 feet, became cooler and still and entirely itself. The kind of air that exists nowhere else, that belongs to the interior of the earth in a way that outdoor air does not. The sound changed too. The generator hum from outside vanished. The absence of wind, of ambient sound, of everything that ordinarily fills the space between noises. Bram moved ahead of Raina with his nose down, and Raina kept her light on him. They went perhaps 40 feet into the cave before it opened up the way Earl had said it would. The narrow passage giving way to a room of maybe 30 feet across, with a ceiling high enough to stand upright, almost alive. Raina stepped into the chamber, and Bram stopped in the center of it. He stood completely still, and then he barked. One bark. Not frantic, not urgent in the way that barks usually are. Just one clean sound that went up to the ceiling and came back down as a wave of echo. And from the far left side of the chamber, from behind a shelf of rock that jutted into the room at knee height and had not been visible from the entrance, came a small voice. It said, "I knew you'd come." His red jacket zipped to his chin, despite the broken zipper, which he had safety pinned shut at some point. An act of such quiet practicality that Raina would think about it later many times. He had one sneaker on, and one foot wrapped in what turned out to be a piece of his own undershirt tied at the ankle. He had a small water bottle, empty, and a granola bar wrapper, and a folded piece of paper tucked into his jacket pocket that he did not take out until much later. He was cold. He was pale. He had a bruise along his right forearm from a fall somewhere along the way. Raina crossed the chamber and crouched in front of him, and Bram came and sat beside her without being told. Levi said, "I knew you'd find me. I knew it was going to be you." And somewhere between the house and the fence line he had taken them off. This was later explained by the fact that Levi had crossed the shallow creek drainage at the property edge, and his boots had gotten sucked into the mud on the far bank, and rather than fight them back on, he had left them and gone the rest of the way. He had gone to the eastern fence line, which he had been going to for 3 weeks, always in the afternoon, always without telling Darnell, because there was something he wanted to do, and he had not found the right moment yet. What he wanted to do was leave something for Bram. Levi had thought about this carefully. He had learned that handlers used tracking cards, laminated squares of paper that held the subject's scent. He had learned that Bram had tracked his scent from his shoe to the fence line during the exercise, and that this meant Bram had Levi's scent somewhere in whatever it was that dogs carried inside them, the way children accept certain things that adults have spent too long second-guessing. He had made a tracking card himself, following a path he had been curious about for weeks. He had found the cave entrance because he had been looking for it, because he had seen the seam in the rock during a previous visit and wanted to know what was inside it. He had slipped on the descent in the dark and come down hard on his arm, and his water bottle had rolled ahead of him down a side channel, and he had followed it. And by the time he had his bearings, the entrance was not where he thought it was, and the light on his phone had given out. He had found the chamber by following the sound of dripping water, which meant following toward moisture, which meant moving to the lowest part of the cave where the air was dampest. A piece of reasoning that was either very wrong or very right, depending on the specific geometry of the cave, though Levi had not known it was right until he found himself in the chamber and felt the space open around him and understood that this was a place where he could breathe and rest and wait. He had waited. He had eaten the granola bar. He had drunk the water. He had used his one working sneaker as a pillow at first, and then put it back on when his foot got cold, and he had wrapped the other foot in his undershirt. In the hours just before Bram found him, his chin dropping to his knees and his breathing going slow in the way of someone whose body is quietly beginning to make compromises. He had believed the whole time that Bram was coming. While Levi waited in the dark of the chamber, his father was outside in the cold. He had stayed for stretches. And then he would find himself at the edge of the staging area, looking toward the ridge, and the staying would become impossible, and he would move. He walked the fence line 3 times during the night. He did it with a flashlight and without calling it in, because calling it in meant using the radio, and using the radio meant other people hearing the sound of his voice, because his voice had stopped being a thing he could control. He thought about the divorce in the way that people think about their failures during the long cold hours of 3 in the morning, not charitably, not with distance, but right up close. He had not been present in the years before the divorce. He had been in the house. He had been at the table. He had been technically and physically located in the life he was supposed to be living. But he had not been in it the way Levi needed him to be in it. He had come back from his second tour carrying things that took up space that should have been for his family, that went into rooms where his attention should have been, and shut the doors quietly. He had known this for a long time. He had been working on it, genuinely, for 2 years now, one piece at a time, the way he had told the deputies he and Levi were building something. That was true, was happening. Levi had started looking at him differently in the last 6 months, with something that was not quite trust yet, but was in the direction of trust, a slight unguardedness at the dinner table, a tendency to stay in the room instead of going to his room, small things that Darnell had noticed and not commented on because commenting on them would change them. He had not known until that moment that his whole quiet project of repair had been the center of everything. He stood at the fence line at 4 in the morning with the flashlight and said Levi's name into the dark, once, quietly, not even calling it, just saying it, just putting the word into the air. And then he went back to the command post and drank bad coffee and waited with his hands around the cup. And the stillness that people mistook for calm was doing its work in him, holding everything in place, keeping the structure upright until something changed. We have the boy. He's alive, preparing to exit the cave system now. Not in a desperate way, not in a bargaining way, not in the way of a child trying to convince himself of something he does not fully believe. In the plain, structural way that certain things are simply true. He had not been afraid. Or he had been afraid and the belief had been larger than the fear, and the larger thing had won. This was what Raina was thinking about when she helped Levi out of the cave. She had found people who had given up waiting and people who had never stopped. She had learned, slowly, that the ones who were still waiting when she arrived shared something she could not always name, a particular quality of interior stillness, like a room where someone has been sitting quietly for a long time, and the room has kept the shape of their patience. Levi had that quality. He had it at 9 years old. She thought about that for a long time afterward. Darnell was at the cave entrance when they came out, because someone had radioed ahead, and Darnell had been at the command post less than a quarter-mile away, and he had run the distance without thinking, without deciding to run, his body having made the decision for him before his mind had finished forming it. He was standing at the seam in the rock face when Bram came out first, and then Raina, and then Levi, squinting against the daylight, his safety-pin jacket glinting at the collar. Darnell made a sound that was not quite a word and crossed the last few feet between them, and Levi walked directly into his arms, his one sneakered foot and one cloth-wrapped foot finding the uneven ground without any particular trouble, because he had waited this long and could walk the rest of the way without help. Darnell held him for a long time without speaking. Later, the medics checked Levi over. The bruised arm was not broken. The foot that had been bare was scraped and cold, but not seriously damaged. His temperature was lower than anyone wanted it to be, but not as low as it might have been, given 2 nights in a cave in October. The on-site medic said he was lucky. She said it several times, which was something Raina recognized because she had worn that expression herself early in her career, before she had learned to stop predicting outcomes in advance. Darnell sat in the back of the medic vehicle with Levi and held his son's wrapped foot in both hands without saying anything. And Levi leaned against him in the way of someone who's very tired and very warm for the first time in a while. He reached into his jacket pocket, careful because the safety pin at the collar was sharp, and took out the folded piece of cardboard. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at Darnell. He said, "I made this for Bram. I was going to leave it on the trail so he'd find it at the next exercise." Darnell looked at the card without taking it from Levi's hand. Levi said, "Can you give it to the lady with the dog?" Darnell said he would. Raina was outside the medic vehicle, standing with Bram beside her, filling out her incident report on a clipboard that had gotten damp in the cave and was now crinkling at the edges. Deputy Price was beside her, asking her to walk him through the timeline again, his pen moving steadily across his own notepad. Raina was explaining Bram's behavior at the cave entrance, the 11 minutes of stillness, trying to find language for it that would fit into an official report, and finding, as she usually did, that the language required was not quite available in the vocabulary that official reports used. She had paused in the middle of a sentence when Darnell appeared at her side. He held out the folded piece of cardboard. He said, "My son wanted you to have this. He made it for your dog." Raina took the card. She opened it. The piece of cloth inside was a small square of blue cotton, soft with washing. She could smell faintly the particular smell of a child, something like warm bread and grass, and whatever soap Levi used, something simple and alive. She turned the card over. On the back, in handwriting that was careful and slightly uneven in the way of someone who was trying to write as neatly as possible, and was almost succeeding, it said, "For Bram. He already knew where I was." Raina stood with the card in her hand for a moment. He was looking, not toward Levi in the medic vehicle, not toward the cave behind them, but at something in the middle distance that Raina could not identify. He was looking at it with his usual concentration, his usual total and undivided attention, as if whatever he was perceiving deserved nothing less. She folded the card and put it in her vest pocket, against her sternum, where she would keep it for the rest of that day, and then the day after, and then eventually move it to the zipper pocket in her kit bag, where it remained for years, going on every search she ran after that one. She never told anyone what the card said, or rather she told it once, to one person, to another handler she trusted, years later, over coffee after a training day that had gone long, and they were both tired in that specific way that the work makes you tired. When the exhaustion has layers, and the quiet at the end of the day has weight. The other handler had held her coffee with both hands and said, "What do you think he meant by it?" Raina had thought about it for a while. She said, "I think he meant that Bram already had his scent. That Bram had it from the day at the fence line 3 weeks before. That if Levi was anywhere in that terrain, Bram was already carrying the thing he needed to find him." The other handler nodded slowly. What the card says is that the boy went into the cave believing he would be found, and that the certainty wasn't wishful thinking, wasn't hope, wasn't fear dressed up as confidence. It was something he had concluded from the available evidence, because he believed a dog was coming for him, and the dog had come. Raina never had a satisfying explanation for the 11 minutes of stillness at the entrance. She wrote in the report that Bram had been working the scent cone, assessing airflow. What she knew, from 7 years of working with Bram, from 2 moments of the leftward tilt that had preceded 2 impossible findings, and that trying to explain it too precisely was the surest way to lose the part that actually mattered. What she believed, though she would not have written it in any report, was that Bram had stood at the entrance for 11 minutes, because he was not just finding the scent. He was finding the specific scent, the one he had cataloged 3 weeks earlier at the fence line. He had recognized it, and he had known, in the way that certain things are known before they are understood, that the boy on the other side of that rock was waiting for exactly him. The card stayed in Raina's kit bag for 6 years. In that time, she and Bram ran 43 searches together. Bram retired at 11, which is old for a working Malinois, with the particular dignity of a dog who has done what he came to do and is ready now for something quieter. Bram looked at her from across the room with his dark, particular eyes. She had never been able to tell, watching him, whether he was thinking about the searches or not thinking about them. She put the card down on the table beside her. On the back, in a 9-year-old's careful handwriting, "For Bram, he already knew where I was." And Bram turned his face toward the window and breathed, and whatever he was thinking about, if he was thinking at all, he kept entirely to himself.